Good evening, everyone. This is the November 13, 2017 Committee of the Whole meeting of the DeKalb City Council. There are speaker request forms in the back if anybody would care to speak to the one item on our Committee of the Whole meeting this evening. And we'd ask you that you give those to Sue Herman, our city clerk. And with that, I'm going to ask Sue to call the roll of the council, please.
Jacobson? Fanouken?
Here.
Marquardt?
Here.
Fagan?
Here.
Noriko?
Here.
Verbeek?
Here.
Favor?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
7 present.
There are no items on the Committee of the Whole meeting that are on the regular agenda for this evening. So we move forward to the one consideration for our Committee of the Whole, and that is Safe Streets Initiative. I'd like to call to the podium now our Police Chief, Gene Lowry. Chief?
Good evening, everyone, council, staff, community. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I feel like I'm out of breath. I feel like I've been going 100 miles an hour all day, so I'm going to try and take a deep breath, regain my composure, and bring it to the table for you. So, as everyone knows, and I want to kind of put probably what everybody knows I'm going to talk about, but put it into a little bit of perspective. Over the last several weeks, we've experienced a series of violent acts in our community, generated by, to be quite frank to you and to our community, if you don't know already, generated by street gangs, at times in combat with each other, in using firearms to deliver their message or solve their problems. As a result of that, we're taking a comprehensive look at everything the city can do to address that. You've already started to see some of those things. Some of them are budgetary, and of course you're going to have quite a lengthy discourse on that this coming Thursday and in the days ahead. But some of those are things that the police can do or that community development can do in conjunction with a wide variety of resources the city has. So what I'm here to discuss tonight and create the forum for, and I want to ensure that the community, and let me just say this about when I say community, it's not just the lifelong residents I'm talking about. It's just not the recent transplants I'm talking about. It's not isolated to students, whether it's public school district students or university or Kish College students. I'm talking about everybody here. Everybody that comes here to work, live, study, and do the things that human beings do, especially in our community. So as part of a measure, and this is only part, to address some of our crime concerns, I'm bringing to the table for you and the community to review tonight the first phase of discussions regarding enacting a Safe Streets Initiative. This Safe Streets Initiative is going to tonight focus on what we can do in regard to parking that can bring certain order maintenance things into perspective, make our community safer, and allow the police officers who are on the street to respond quicker, to identify issues in the neighborhoods most affected by crime faster, and for us to be able to do things in a proactive manner to ensure we don't continue a pattern of violence. You've heard me say before, and I'll say it again, and this is not in regard to accountability. I'm fully accountable for everything the good police department does, both in a positive way and maybe not so positive way. That's my responsibility. But on this front, I'm going to bring an initiative to you that can tell you what you can do as a council to help us make our streets safer in a neighborhood that is plagued with all sorts of criminal activity that I think that we can take a significant step on to reduce that problem in the neighborhood. Excuse me. So I guess I want to look back historically one more step. You recall between 2012 and into 2014, I came to the council and asked for a variety of parking regulatory changes in this same neighborhood. And at that time, there was some pushback. And that pushback came in the form of making a dramatic change in how it impacted people within that neighborhood. But when we implemented those changes, which, just to refresh your recollection for the folks who weren't on the council at that time, excuse me, we went onto key streets like Edgebrook, Kimberly, eventually Greenbrier, and many of the streets west of Annie Glidden, and we did some changing in regard to parking regulations. Those changes, in effect, began to restrict or limit parking. And what we saw as a result of some of those changes was going into a 3-year cycle of decline in public safety concerns, a specific decline in crime. Now, I'm in no way saying this is the one answer. This is the be-all, end-all. But I can tell you from past experience, if you're looking for a measure that has some evidence-based results, what I'm going to talk to you tonight will bring that to you. The city currently has a multitude of parking regulations in various areas of this community, some of which are so disparate and so non-uniform that it's oftentimes difficult for even the police to sort it out. I can only imagine what it's like for our residents and visitors to this community to sort out. If you go down the street, and I have to say it, especially if you go into the historic neighborhood, every street seems to have a different set of rules and regulations. Maybe if we had the recycle rights on all those signs we had up there, we might be able to address some of our financial concerns in our budget. I look at trying to make things simpler, and I know that the Public Works Director and his resources within his department are already well underway to bringing that to you. As a matter of fact, what I'm bringing to you tonight has probably put a bump in the road for Director Holdeman to some degree. So what I'm saying to you tonight is this. We know that certain parking regulations can help benefit our ability to control crime. It can also discourage people from coming in here and parking in areas open, especially in high crime areas, that would likely not take that opportunity if they were going to stand out like a sore thumb. So let me talk a little bit about this measure. And I'm going to probably say this more than once, but I want to preface this for you now. From the time we have begun these more exigent discussions with stakeholders such as the university and students, to residents, and some of the neighborhoods we have not even hit yet, some of the faith-based groups we have been to, we're kind of jamming this input into the public arena. Because it's important for us to hear it as we craft a final form of an ordinance to come to you, and it's important for you to hear it, so you can make an informed decision about this request. In my talks with residents, university officials, students, just about anybody. Today, I met with some representatives from a local organization dealing with rental property owners. Everyone I talked to has been supportive of this, even to the extent that it does have an impact on their respective lives. I assure you the input and stakeholder input conversations are going to continue in the days ahead. We already have meetings scheduled for this week and going on. So here's what we're going to propose. We're trying to look at this pretty holistically in the area that's commonly identified as the Annie Glidden North neighborhood. In the police world, we call it our policing zone 1. If we want to put a geographical marker on this, I'd say we can really look at everything north of Lucinda in the northwest corridor. But what I'm going to propose to begin the discussion, but this discussion is going to come at you rapidly because we're going to come back at you at the next meeting for a first reading, and then the following meeting in December for a second reading. And I know before I even go into this, you're going to ask, well, if you're looking for all this input, why are we moving so quickly? So here's my response to that. If we don't enact an ordinance to set the stage for what we are planning to do, we are going to shortchange ourselves from a budgetary impact perspective, and we are going to commit hundreds and hundreds of hours of the community's time and our time, and if you decide not to move on it, it will be a waste of time and money. So we need to plan this to move forward with certain qualifications that we all have to understand. The first is this, that this is a proposal of parking restrictions within this Safe Streets initiative that will ban parking in areas in this region from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. and make it a prohibitive area to park subject to tow. This will not take away other ordinances already in effect, such as the snow ordinance, right? When we have a large amount of snow. This will not change what happens at any other time of day, maybe with an exception or two. And I'll talk about those exceptions momentarily. But there are some things to work out in this, and I want to make sure we have that up front, that you're hearing it, but also that you have a commitment to where we'll go with it before we take any enforcement action. So that's the first big basic criteria, a 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. ban. What has this done in other communities? Well, as you know, I spent the bulk of my career with the Collier County Sheriff's Office and retired in 2010. I went to the Crystal Lake Police Department, a city of 44,000 with a small college within its jurisdiction. And that 2 years I spent with the Crystal Lake Police Department, I was the deputy chief. And then by the grace of this community and the Almighty, I was fortunate enough to come here. And despite some of the challenges, I wouldn't trade it for the world. But in Crystal Lake, we had a 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. parking ban, citywide, no exceptions. Let me tell you what that did for the police. Our patrol officers could drive up and down the street and see a car out of place. And they would stop and inquire why. Or they would take the necessary enforcement action. You may want to take a look at the crime numbers in Crystal Lake compared to ours. And I want to qualify everything I say tonight. I don't want to frame it all in negative. We have a great community. We have so many opportunities here. And community, again, is everything. Our university, our lifelong residents, everybody. Our business owners, everybody. We have a lot to offer. But we're in a bit of a pickle right now. We got some fiscal challenges. We got some crime challenges. We got some decisions to make. But in that city where I came from, the impact was notable. It was also notable that almost every suburb of any size in the greater Chicago area has parking restrictions of this nature. Now, we have had such a diverse lay of the land here. And what I mean by that is this. It seems like, and this is probably more anecdotal than scientific, this comment, but I have to make it. It seems like actions in the past have been taken by the city to address specific limited interest groups coming to the individuals or groups coming to the table complaining about something. It's this parking issue, that signage issue. And we react with the creation of an ordinance with the input of only a few. So as we walk down this road, we have to act with as much input as we can. This is not to create a draconian atmosphere. This is to create a safe atmosphere. But we also have to have a little bit of heart, a little love going on in this as well. So in Crystal Lake, when Mr. and Mrs. Smith were going to have their Christmas party, they could contact the station. They get a temporary permit to ensure that their Christmas party goers were taken care of. I could see that happening throughout the city as long as we know it. As long as we have a process in place to appropriately permit those vehicles. Now, in Crystal Lake, we didn't have such a big problem with rental property surplus. And I'm going to quit saying Crystal Lake because I don't even want to think about it anymore. But I am going to say that other place. But in that other place, we didn't have the rental property surplus and neighborhood destabilization we're starting to see here. And I don't want to continue to look at it from a negative perspective, but we have to acknowledge it as we move forward. As such, we didn't have the same concerns that high-density rental property, and especially high-density student property off campus, would create. So in light of that, we have to address that concern. And we have to do that by getting the input from you, as council members, from staff. But hey, not to put anyone behind the bus on this, but we better listen to these folks coming to the table. And we better be prepared to be decisive. We better be prepared to not languish in debate. So the permitting process is another big component of this, and it has to address a variety of things. Now, the city manager has heard it from me time and time again. I think it's unethical for the police to take money for permits. It should come from some other city department. But the police have to be actively engaged in this permitting process, and especially the temporary permitting processes. It's not healthy to be those who keep the cash flow in their office and issue permits to also be the enforcers. Secondly, I'd like to talk about some of the other things that dovetail into this a little bit. We've talked about some evidence-based, what I would call supportive data of how successful this can be. We talked about the need. We certainly have seen that. We know that in our recent shootings, we know that we've had some bad folks that moved into our area. And that's not bad folks based on an identity. It's bad folks based on decision-making. So I'm not pigeonholing anyone. But a couple other components that were, unless some news came in real recently, we're waiting to hear from, but we've asked the Park District. Welsh Park, we know, has been a hotbed of negative activity in that neighborhood. Not because of the kids that enjoy that park during the day, but because what happens in that park after hours. we've asked them to institute a sunrise to sunset component to that park. That will give us the same kind of ability as this parking initiative will to identify those who shouldn't be there and address them through whatever means would be necessary at any given point in time. In conjunction with that, we've looked at some of the ancillary issues of this parking regulation and this request of the Park District to address Walsh Park. And I have to say, there are a couple that have to be addressed. Let me start with Walsh Park first. Knowing the problems we've had in Walsh Park, knowing the problems we've had on Greenbrier and Crane, and primarily Russell, I think we need to be a little more stringent. And I'll tell you what I would like, and I'll tell you what the citizens have told me so far, and I'm waiting to hear for more. And I have to tell you, the folks I met with this afternoon, I said, I believe that the police department is overwhelmingly supported by this community. Overwhelmingly supported. I am so grateful for that. So grateful. But I never hear that voice at the table. I never hear that voice at the table. So I've asked them, come forward to you. And I know they do. I know they're awful willing. Anybody with a keyboard's willing to talk to you, right? I want them to show up here and say to you what they want. And sometimes they say things I don't like. But that's part of the process, right? But one of the things I want to ask about that ties into Welsh Park is we're proposing a ban along Russell and on Crane from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That is to address a more finite issue. And here's how that component ties into our co-policing initiative with the university. We're already in the process of building or planning and discussing an ability to create safe routes in that neighborhood, especially for after-hours events off campus, but to get students to and from and neighbors to and from any location during the nighttime hours. So that thoroughfare on Russell and that thoroughfare on Annie Glidden, that is, normal kicks into that too, but those first two really kick into a high level of student traffic. I think on some Thursday and Friday nights, it's almost like a herd migrating north into the student-based campus, off-campus residential living areas. And unfortunately, sometimes when it's late at night, depending on where everyone's been and what they've been doing, we often see people alone walking down those routes. But we're trying to create a safe route zone in there so we can have a greater police presence and we can do more in a variety of ways to make those safer. And some of those initiatives you'll hear about tonight, some of those you'll hear about down the road. So Welsh Park, one of the ancillary issues that's going to be a component of this. Let me talk about the other ancillary issue, and that's almost insulting because it addresses the people who have homes or some other rental property here that are residents that are non-students and some that are students, but they're in typical residential neighborhoods. For example, the one-way or the one-block-long streets off of Russell that end in a cul-de-sac. The area of the North 5th Ward in the Historic District. Fox Hollow subdivision, Dorkin Lane, and there's a few others we could mention. When you impose a restrictive parking program, you not only have impact on the area that these measures target, you impact the curtilage those neighborhoods immediately in the area that are within walking distance. Another group you impact, especially in that neighborhood as we know it now, are the churches, the faith-based community. So when you put parking restrictions in place in a measure of this nature that this community is not used to, people who don't have a place to stay or a parking space provided by their landlord or on their property are going to look for places to park. But they're really not the ones I'm worried about, because we're going to do some things to try and take care of them. The ones I'm worried about, I'm not worried on their behalf, I'm worried about those neighbors' behalf. I'm worried about all of the residents, but the residents in the area that is kind of on the curtilage of all this impact. So I don't want an ordinance proposed that doesn't take into consideration some restrictions and permitting in neighborhoods like Fox Hollow, on streets like Dorkin, on the one-block streets just off of Russell going to the east. We can't do that. We can't look at Sunflower up on the north end by the NIU School of Nursing and say, we don't have to worry about them. We do. Because we will force people who don't have a place to be, that are up there for whatever reason, some good, some not so good, to invade those neighborhoods. So you're going to see in this presentation tonight, but in more detail in the presentations ahead for the first and second reading, about more specifics about what we actually want to do. So let me tell you what the residents have told me so far, and what other representatives going out into the community have gathered so far as well. People are willing to accept these regulations if we do a couple of things. One, let me talk to you about the Fifth Ward, and I still the historic district. I need a meeting with those folks there. That has yet to come. Of the ones we've touched, I hear that, gosh, we would really like to ban all parking except resident parking in those neighborhoods. Now, when I first started to contemplate bringing this to you, I thought, boy, I don't know if anybody will listen to this. The people in this community are ready. When I talked to some other folks up off of Russell and in a couple of those little dead-end streets off of Normal, they're saying the same thing. They'd like to see resident-only permitted parking on those streets. I wholeheartedly agree with them. And remember, resident's a resident. If you're a student resident, you're a resident. If you're a lifelong resident, you're a resident. If you're a transplant resident, you're a resident. There's no difference. So we have to address the concerns of those neighborhoods in the curtilage. So what did I just talk about? I talked about the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. parking restriction, no parking on the street, tow zone, Russell, and Crane. Everyone in University Village that needs a place to park has one within University Village. No one needs to park on the street from University Village. Anyone in University Plaza that has a room and a bed has adequate parking. No one needs to park on the street. The residents off of Russell have been living in a constant state of disruption with antics along Russell Road, ranging from minor things that college kids do and any kids do, up to some pretty serious crimes. They're tired. Gosh, you know, you guys probably hate to see me come up here. I look at this and go, There's so many things we're trying to get done in such a short period of time. But I have to give credit to folks at University Village. When we've asked them to get new cameras in, they've done it. When we've asked about what can you point some of those cameras at Welsh Park, they've done it. We're asking them to change the hours of Welsh Park, and they're taking it to their folks to do it. I hope it's successful. I'm asking you to change the parking on Russell and Crane from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I'm asking these other neighborhoods that are affected by the impact of this ordinance also see some restrictions. I'd like to see the historic district have resident-only permitted parking. No one else. Northern Illinois University has more than adequate parking. They've been a good partner in this, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. It's time to let those neighborhoods reclaim themselves and give them some peace. We also know that that neighborhood, especially on John Street, has been afflicted with some significant crimes. Shootings, aggravated batteries, and the likes of other serious crimes. So it's not like we're imposing something that is unwanted or unwarranted. As I go down and look at where we're headed next, I want to talk to you about this permitting process. We have to do something because we're faced with a dilemma. And let me talk to you about that dilemma. When you look at the UDO for the west side of Annie Glidden, the newer side, the newer development, they're supposed to have enough beds with some surplus for guests built in to their parking structures, their parking lots, in accordance with all of the plans that they had back in the day and all of the concerns by the city and the community to address that parking need. But when you look at the east side, the side that was grandfathered in outside of the UDO because of it needing to be, it's not the same story. So we have to look at what we can do on a unit-by-unit basis, building by building, unit by unit, of how many people should be there and how to permit, as needed, different locations. But we also need to have land or managers or property managers and property owners be accountable too. So we have to take into consideration them as residents and do our best to not make this a burdensome change. I also don't want to see people having to walk numerous blocks to get from a safe parking location to their residence, especially in trying times in that neighborhood, or peak public service demand times, might be more accurate to say. So that parking process, that permitting process, is under discussion already between us and the folks at the university. We're trying to implement that in other areas. Commander Lekas has been meeting with the faith-based community in regard to how they feel about this, because it certainly impacts their parking lots. The overflow that could impact them and not really change what we're trying to accomplish. But as we look at that, we also have to draw a line too, to some degree. We can only right the wrongs of the past. And I'm going to be honest with you, here's the wrong, I think. I think where we failed as a city. When we built out all those properties west of Annie Glidden, and we were in the prosperous days of 25,000 plus students in and out of this campus, even really before some of the satellites grew up, NIU satellite campuses. We were piling kids in here. It was an economic engine rivaled by many. but not really. Those many were trying to be that engine. In the light of that, we built up a tremendous amount of new rental property. The mistake was that when we did that, we forgot about what was going to happen on the east side of Annie Glidden, in that Annie Glidden North corridor. We forgot it. Or if we didn't forget it, because I wasn't here and I don't think any of you were really part of that process, you may be familiar with it, but I don't think you were on the council at that point in time. But there was no consideration that I can see, and if there's someone out there that can correct me, please do, for what would happen in that neighborhood, in those properties that don't have enough parking under the UDO now, that were going to be left when the vacuum left, or when the vacuum was created and the students went to better housing, which was what they would like, what any person would like. And that was the beginning of setting the stage for how a neighborhood can be very, very destabilized when those properties are no longer fillable. So the permitting process is important. There's a lot of stakeholders, but the balance has got to be at some point in time. And it's like I look at the council. And when we get into the conversation about service delivery, I'll probably say this more. But you know how many times people reach out to you? Sometimes before they even call the police on an issue that should come to the attention of the police. Solve my problem. You're the elected, right? Apparently some folks have forgotten how to use that contact information at the police station or any other department it may impact. But at some point in time, convenience and public safety, you have to make a judgment. And that judgment is simply a choice of whether you err and do the wrong thing or do the right thing and enhance public safety. Permitted parking. So, and I'm sure I'm missing so many things that I want to say. I got to smile to myself because I keep thinking about Alderman Jacobson's comment when he mentioned last week that it's always, every time I say I'm going to be brief, it ends up being like a dissertation. I want to tell you what we want to do in the days ahead. I want to get this ordinance passed before January, so we know fiscally what we have to deal with in preparing to implement these regulations if you decide to go down that road. If you decide. I want to make sure we hear the voices of the community. I've been meetinged out, but I've got more meetings to schedule ahead. I've got more citizens I've got to hit up. There's more to do. We've got to hear that. But we got to have the mechanism in place to deal with it. So stakeholder input is huge. The bones of this I've thrown out to you tonight. That process, not only the ordinance itself, but the permitting process is key. It's huge. So as I look down the road, I try to put myself in the perspective of the community that this impacts. The residents, the people who live here. And I also have to be conscious of how this impacts students. Not that students are better than anyone else here, because they're not. Not that the residents are better than anyone else here. They're not. They're all equally important. But there are some special needs we have to look at. We constantly have to educate students because they rotate in and out here. I feel like just about the time we've got a group orientated to living this community and doing the right thing, the next group is already banging the door down. And I know the university to some degree feels that way as well. But as such, I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can. And let me give you an example, and then I'm going to shut my mouth so you can begin to interrogate me. We're working with NIU, and I've even mentioned it in the presence of the mayor, about what options we can provide. I've said The city needs to look at what parking considerations we can do in some of our current city lots. I've asked the university to give that some consideration on their end, and they have already come up with some solutions for after-hours parking. We're looking for more down that road as our discussions continue. I know we got some property at 912 Edgebrook. I wonder if a parking lot in the middle of that area would help. I don't know. It would help if it was a pay lot. But what would it do for us? Us, the community, us, the police department, us, the city, and more importantly, would it have a positive impact on taking crime away from our streets or diminishing it? But here's the timeline. You know, and I debated this. I wanted to move forward on this really fast. But I can't just do that. I want the ordinance to go through as fast as we can with some qualifications or considerations built into it. But I want to make sure we give everyone time so we can iron out these processes. And I'm not impressed with how well we iron out some of our processes. I want you to hear everyone's voice, not the voices of the few that walk up to this podium and day in and day out or week in and week out have nothing but negative things to say. God, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I believe Brendan Behan was an Episcopalian bishop. I think it was like late 1800s. He said this: critics are like eunuchs in a harem. They know how it's done. They've seen it done every day, but they're unable to do it themselves. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to input. But you can't turn your ear only to a negative voice. Sometimes the negative voices are right, though, I have to say. So what I'm asking you tonight is to open the door for the dialogue. I'm going to be quiet and give you the opportunity to ask me some questions. But I want to assure you that input's the biggest part of this process. Having said that, I'm going to be quiet and give you the floor.
Thank you, Chief. We have one person who wishes to speak to this. I think what I'm going to do, Tricia, if you don't mind, I'm going to have our consul here ask a few questions of the chief, and then I'm assuming you're going to want to speak on this topic. So, who would like to start? Alderman Noriko.
Chief, I just wanted to clarify that for the North 5th, including John Street, that what you're proposing is overnight parking ban from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., but residents would be able to get a permit for parking on the street.
I think the answer to that is yes and no. It depends on how the council rolls with that.
Okay.
There is that component, no parking 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., except that which is permitted,
Okay.
resident only, or total parking ban in that neighborhood, which is what I'm hearing from those residents,
Oh, okay.
with permitted resident parking only.
Okay. And in the case of rental property, multi-unit, each unit would be able, I would assume, to get a resident parking permit.
It would depend. If it's a unit that has sufficient parking and is in compliance with the Uniform Development Ordinance, the UDO, the answer would be no.
Mm-hmm.
There might be an exception. Let's say there's an event or something that we need to be cognizant of. That's where a temporary parking situation could be implemented as part of the permitting process.
Mm-hmm. Because I know that there are some units in that area, not in the Annie Glidden area, but in the North Fifth area, that there is not off-street parking. You know, I don't know how that happened, when that happened, but,
Right.
you know, that is the reality. So I would assume then that situation would have to be looked at as part of the permitting
I think
process.
that's a key component of permitting. So if,
Okay.
as I said, if you're a resident in a neighborhood such as that, with that designation of resident parking only by permit, and whether it's a 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. ban, or it's a total, if you're a resident, we have to have some options available.
Okay.
We have to have some options available. Here's a side note to this. So those rental properties, or any property that is outside of the UDO in regard to occupancy, so let's say somebody has a 2-bedroom apartment and they have 6 people subleasing it, those will come to the foreground because it's based on beds.
Okay.
And that's the bed by bed, unit by unit, bed by bed analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alderman Fagan.
Thanks, Chief. I think this is a great way of first stepping on trying to grasp what we can and where we're at. I really appreciate that. What the map that you gave us is the area of what you want.
That's the area that's affected at this time, yes.
Okay. And getting back to Kate, I lived on Augusta in the 90s. And I took a student house, converted into a single family. And at that time, it was 2 to 6, you could not park on that street. All right? Now, with that said, if I had family over overnight and I called the police department, they were great about it. They understood it. But at that time, for some reason, it's changed from the early 90s to now. I don't know why, but I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. And, you know, it's a good point, Alderman. There are many streets in the neighborhood that we're talking about that already have a 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. prohibition. For example, Russell. But it's doing it in a comprehensive, all-encompassing manner that will have the impact. And I always go back to the fact that we've got to protect those other neighborhoods. We can't have folks coming into town, parking all over, that don't live there and having an impact on the peace and tranquility in a neighborhood with the intent to go to somewhere to engage in a, you know, partying or something like that that would be typical in our community, any college community, or any community, period.
Alderman Fanouken.
Gino, I want you to know that I definitely support what you're trying to do here, and more of my concerns are in the implementation process. And you've touched on that a little bit, but how does the city ID who those residents are? Because we're going to talk about some transients, we're going to talk about some students who live in the area who, particularly with students, will have their driver's license, their car registration still registered back home.
Right.
And they may or may not be on the lease. So how are we going to attempt to identify them as a resident?
Well, if they're, as a resident, I think part of the permitting process is, especially when you talk about students, I mean, let's be honest, is that not only do we need to make sure in every permitting process that we identify a vehicle with a person, but that we identify the vehicle and the person with a property. And that's twofold. Some of that's on the city, some of that we can do, some of that's on the property owner as well. So if there is a high-density rental unit that says, hey, we need more parking because we're in the older part that's grandfathered in, then we're also going to need some information from them to assure us that we are getting the actual need. But double and triple bunking outside of the ordinance, that's where I don't think we need to meet a need.
And I think I agree with you there too. But let's say that the permitted use of an apartment is 4 residents. And yet, so those 4 residents' names are on the lease, but they have a 5th or a 6th. You know, that person should not be able to identify as a resident of those properties. That's where I'm going with this.
And I want to be sure I understand it, because if there are 6 people in that unit, I would have to believe that there's got to be some communication between that group and the property owner or rental property manager saying, we have 6 people here. Or they might be in violation of their lease.
And I understand that, and I'll leave that discussion to Alderman Jacobson. And it's just, though, I want to make one other thing clear, though, that the permits that we're talking about in this permitted area would only be for residents of those permitted areas. So like somebody who lived on Kimberly west of Normal could not get a permit, correct? And then park on the east side of Normal Road.
Say that one again for
All
me,
right,
please.
so if
You're
somebody,
gonna zone them effectively.
Hmm?
Are you gonna put them into different zones?
yeah, you're gonna put them in zones. What I'm saying is, let's say somebody lived on Kimberly west of Normal Road,
Okay.
and they could identify that as a residency. But they're not gonna be able to get a permit to park across Normal Road on the east side. It's only gonna be those folks that live in the map that you've given us in those yellow zones.
Correct.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's why they're differentiated by color.
Mhm.
I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that point so that it was clear to everybody else, too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Jacobson.
As the council members, and probably Gene know, I did send a pretty long email today on this issue. I think that in my conversations with the collar neighborhoods, for certain, there has been a discussion that they would like to go 24 hours a day resident only. I have heard that complaint brought up in many of those neighborhoods, both in my ward and in Bill's, for years. And I know some initiatives were underway to start looking at some of those things to see if we can change them. I hope this initiative brings them up quicker effectively to get those things taken care of. In terms of the red area, in the document that was provided in the backup, in the map, let me pull that back up just so I have it in front of me. I think one of the biggest problems, especially in the area colloquially, I'm not even gonna try it.
Colloquially?
It's not coming
I
out
can't even
right.
say it, so.
Known as Greek Row, isn't necessarily residents. Well, even over in the 7th Ward, over in Echo Park, a lot of those properties were built with adequate parking. The landlords enforce permits in those lots. So the issue isn't necessarily always residents, it's visitors to those places. And again, in my home, much like your home, if you want to have a friend or a family member, most especially in the college age people, it's boyfriends and girlfriends. The issue is there's nowhere for them to park. Even if there's spots in that lot, they are not welcome to park in those lots. And it's exacerbated, obviously, in the Greek Road neighborhood by the limited parking for a lot of the properties. And I think that's something that we need to certainly take a look at. I mean, the reality is, while I appreciate there's a public safety aspect, it's not a convenience issue. If you make it uncomfortable for students to live there, they will leave that neighborhood. Vacating those units, most especially the Greeks, in a non-parking environment is only going to attract more of the less desirable people into the neighborhood. People without cars, people that can't afford cars, generally people that we are trying to find the balance of in that neighborhood. And my worry is that in doing something this drastic, this fast, you are going to make the neighborhood very unfriendly for the student population in it. And I think that's my biggest fear looking at what some of these proposals are. I think we can find a good balance between the public safety aspect and the convenience aspect of those people that actually live there. I think that there is a way to do that, and I stated that out in my email today, or at least started to flesh some of those ideas out. I appreciate the fact Crane and Russell need to go no parking. I mean, I realize there is a public safety issue in that neighborhood, and it's generally not residents. Again, the single-family residences have adequate driveway and garage space. University Village has adequate space. University Plaza has adequate space. I realize that was intentionally designated to some of the overflow in the neighborhood, but think that at this point, if we're going to make some headway in the park, that that's a necessary reality on those two streets now. In looking at this map, however, if you were a guest or a visitor, there's nowhere within the neighborhood you could park at this point under this ban. There's nowhere you can put your car. And the reality of busing them in from the convo or putting them in some lot out in the middle of nowhere and having them drive or ride a bus or walk into this neighborhood, again, helps to destabilize the limited stabilization we have in the neighborhood and the student population. I don't know how to necessarily fix all those issues. Again, I think there can be a balance. I think it's going to take a lot of conversation, and would prefer that all of the yellow areas probably go to 24-hour-a-day resident only, and that the red areas go to 2 to 6 resident only. And how we administer that and how we roll that out, and hearing Alderman Fagan's comment, the reason rules changed is because in many communities, it's very easy to call the police department and just let them know, hey, my car will be parked on the street. You can leave them a message and they won't ticket you. In our community, for many, many years, up until now, we have significant parking ticket enforcement on those streets. They come and write every single car, every single night, a minute after those deadlines expire in some cases. And it was the residents pushing back and saying, hey, we need somewhere to park. We don't have places for us to park in some of these places. We don't have places for our guests to park. And to dictate away that parking, again, I think is much what we did with the bars. When things were good, when things were growing, when all the buildings were full with students, nobody planned for the future, certainly as Gene mentioned, but nobody expected it ever to go away. I mean, they never expected the tail off of the student population. There was always some belief that there would be enough students, especially in the Greek Row neighborhood, that would be willing to live in that neighborhood, whether it was because of the proximity to their Greek organizations, whether it was proximity to what amenities were there at that point, a grocery or a movie theater and a bar, or whether it was because of the price aspect. They were much cheaper than the Echo Park apartments. It was when the students went away, obviously, now that we're starting to deal with some of those major transitional challenges in that neighborhood, and even so much so that it's crept out into the 7th Ward and Echo Park. They're dealing with some of those same issues. So the reality is, to make that neighborhood even more unfriendly to those students, where do they go? Do they creep out into the residential neighborhoods themselves? Because that's the only place they can have friends or significant others at their place. Do they creep in to other neighborhoods we don't expect them to do because we dictated them out of this neighborhood? I think we have to move quickly, but put the in-depth thought in the rollout and how we're going to make it work in up front, and make sure those things are fully vetted before we jump into something that could end up biting us in a different way without thinking about it.
The challenge is certainly there. Pat, before you say something, I'd like Gene to react in any way he'd like to Alderman Jacobson.
You know, surprisingly enough, Alderman Jacobson and I agree on a lot of things in regard to this initiative. I don't necessarily agree with the component that this would disenfranchise or destabilize the neighborhood further. I think as long as we offer opportunity and other alternatives that we have at our disposal, is it that hard for someone who has a guest over for the weekend to park at the Convo and catch a shuttle over, or to drop them off at the Convo and bring them back? I don't think so. If there is something that's bigger than that we can permit on a 1-day or a 2-day basis, I think that's something we could easily address. But there's also, there's no utopia here. You're going to be faced with a decision ultimately that's going to say, where is the balance between making sure everybody has what they want and public safety? And at least my initial discussions with student representatives and others in the neighborhood, right now, people want to enhance safety.
Yeah, this all started with safety,
Yeah.
you know. Alderman Favor.
So I just want to just add my comments. In my understanding, and I think it's been fleshed out, that the red checkered area is a no parking, no exceptions, no permits, 2 to 6. And I'm in agreement with that. That's what I think our discussion was. And right now, as we're talking about, this is for public safety. It's a move we're going to make immediately. It might be a temporary ban, and then we'll talk about potentially doing permitting for guests and visitors. I already think, there's already 2 large parking lots in the north area that could quickly become paid parking lots. If there's a demand for parking, there's 2 parking lots that could. What you've got the Campus Cinema parking lot
That the city won't allow anyone to park in.
And then there's Edgebrook property, which we've already mentioned, and I'm sure if there was security cameras and proper lighting, and you know what, we're business friendly. Bring an opportunity, and we'll talk about it. But I just want to say I support that. I think, like you said, in the immediate term, in the immediate time frame, I'm supporting the ban completely between 2 and 6 in the red area, and resident only in the yellow area. And like I said, I was concerned about, again, how difficult would that be for the police to have to worry, you see a car and now you have to worry, is it permitted, is it not permitted? But I look forward to more to come. I had other questions, but look forward to hearing more in the future. Thank you.
Alderman Fagan.
Gene touched on it, what I wanted to point out, so thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? We do have some comments from the audience. We have one speaker, Tricia DeBoo. And Jean, if you just have a seat there, maybe you'd like to comment depending on what Tricia has to say.
I thank you for giving me this opportunity. My name is Tricia DeBoo, and my husband Peter Schramm and I own a 4-unit rental property at 141-143 John Street. It's located on the west side of the street with the river running behind it. If you go to look at our property, you'll see it appears that there's a driveway adjacent to the property. Truth is, this is not a driveway, it's a spillway. Our building is located in the lowest point on the whole street, so whenever there's any heavy raining, the water goes running down this spillway into the river. The spillway is sloped toward the river, so it's only possible to park one car in that spillway. If you go any further back, toward the back of the building, the sides of the spillway get to be too high and you can't open the doors of the car. We are not able to offer any off-street parking for our tenants, and there's no way we can modify the property to be able to offer that. I'm asking that we have to rely on off-street parking for our tenants. If we don't have off-street parking for our tenants, we won't be able to find tenants for our building, and this building constitutes 40% of our livelihood. Ideally, we'd like to see that there be parking on only one side of the street. Right now, the way they have it, the tenants have to move their cars back and forth every day between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m., or they'll get a parking ticket. We'd like to see parking on one side of the street. Permit parking would be fine with us, and we'd also like it if, when these tenants have visitors from out of town, the out-of-town visitors can also get a permit. Right now, the tenants that we have, 2 of the apartments are occupied by people who are from Washington State, one is from Indiana, and another one is from Texas. And they do have people, their family, coming to visit them from time to time. Please take this into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. That was the only person in the audience who wants to speak to this subject, and unless somebody very quickly gets up and gives a speaker request form to City Clerk Sue Herman, we will let the council continue discussion. Mike? Alderman Morkort.
Have we thought of or fleshed out anything about the process of, you said you did not feel that the police department should be collecting money and doing that part. Have we fleshed out any of that process?
That's already under discussion within the city. So, yeah, I think a lot of our permitting process has gone through finance in the past. It's something we have to work out internally, but that's more of an ethical question based on my upbringing, so.
Well, it does come into play with cost. I can see where this would take, maybe not a considerable amount of time, but there would be some time involved in just the process of handing out a permit and making sure that we had, who was a record of all the permits. Was there any talk about cost of the permit for a resident for covering this, or were the residents that you've talked to willing to pay for that type of a permit?
I've discussed it with a representative from the council. I've discussed it with members of the community. And everyone so far that I've talked to said they're willing to pay a fee to have that privilege of parking on the street, much like every other municipality that has a parking ordinance of this nature, and would be happy to do that in support of this. I do think it's a cost. And as you know, we don't have someone staffing our front desk at the police station 24 hours a day.
Right.
So we rely on our dispatch center to field walking complaints after 5 p.m. at night. So it would be a burden if we had to deal with parking permitting after hours. But we also want to build enough flexibility in the program for those temporary situations. I also think that, and I would encourage the council to go out and ask their constituents to see how they feel about it, especially in the impacted area. When I talk to those who are in the area, they are very supportive of it. But I haven't heard all the voices, so.
Right. And would enforcement be solely on the police department?
Yeah, the enforcement is, there may be another component, but it primarily will be on the police. And as far as the comments tonight, from a variety of comments that were given tonight, I'd like to say that we are heavy enforcers of parking violations, but that's simply not the truth. We haven't had the resources in quite some time to be able to do proactive parking enforcement. It's really been response by complaint.
Right. Because that's where I see, I'm in favor of some form of parking restrictions. But the nuts and bolts and the enforcement with our limited resources, I foresee some additional costs going into this. Just wanting to be sure that the permitting would be covering those costs to a certain extent, if possible.
I think the permitting should have a fee associated with it. It should be fair. It shouldn't be exorbitant. It shouldn't be simply designed to be a revenue generator, but it should be designed to cover the costs of putting it out and processing it.
Right.
So I agree with that.
Okay.
Any other comments from City Council? Taking into account that there are no other comments from the audience on this particular issue. Gene, we thank you for your comments. The challenges are not going to be easy ones. This decision regarding this are not going to be easy. For the benefit of our audience and for those at home, this is a committee of the whole meeting. No firm decision will be coming out of this meeting. However, Gene, what you'd like to see us do is to be prepared for a first reading of an ordinance that will encompass our best effort to incorporate what you have asked for and what our council thinks is right, and that would be drawn up by staff, and that first reading would come on the 27th of November. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Hearing no further discussion, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make that Second.
Been moved and seconded. Discussion? We are adjourned. Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.